Now that we've taken care of the profile page, the next page that we're going to move over to is the Explore page. And I'm sure at this point, if you try going there, you're not going to see anything. And that's due to the fact that our dummy data is not filling out the grid post component correctly. So we're going to take a couple of steps first before we actually write the queries to be able to fetch the two pieces of data, the two sets of data that we need within the Explore page. Remember, it basically consists of suggesting users up at the top and then all of the Explore posts underneath. Before we do that, I want to make one change to our table, and that is to our users table. I want to go to modify, and then I want to add a new column at the bottom, which is going to be called created at. So we can get a value, a timestamp for whenever a new user is created, and we'll see why in just a second. So we're going to give it a type of timestamp. We don't need to make it nullable. This is one of those rare cases when we don't need to make a new column nullable, and we want to give it a default value of now. In most cases, it will have to be nullable just so that there's not inconsistencies among the different rows in our table that we set up. But for created at, it works without us providing a null value in all of the existing rows. So once we've added that, what we're going to have for all of our users is if we query for our users, we should have created at values, but for all of our previous users, they're the same date. So what I'd like to do now is, so that we actually have some different users to explore and some different posts to explore in our Explore page, I would recommend going off, and this is what I'm going to do too. Let's go off and create some new users and have those users add some different posts so our application looks a bit more interesting. There's one thing I want you to be aware of when it comes to uploading these different images that we didn't talk about when it came to uploading them with Cloudinary and using that incoming transformation. So I'm going to go to my upload preset, go to upload manipulations, and edit the transformation. By default, I had the mode set to scale, and the result, if you take a look at an image, let's look at the original image. You see this is the original image here, but if you look at scale, it scales it up to 500 by 500, but it changes the aspect ratio, so it's a bit stretched here. These both have the transformation of scale. This one here has one called limit and pad, so it keeps basically the entire image and it pads out the remaining space in order to make sure it fills up that 500 by 500 requirement. And then for the last one, we have this crop effect where you can see that just basically the middle of the image is cropped, but it doesn't change the aspect ratio, but you just see a lot less. So this is something to be aware of when it comes to uploading your images. I would recommend something maybe like limit, crop, or limit and pad. It's really up to you how you want to, modify these images as you upload them. And finally, one last thing that I noticed about both posts and saved posts for a given user's profile is that we want them ordered in descending order by their created at field. So we want the newest posts on top and the oldest ones at the bottom. Now this involves changing the saved post table. We need to modify it and also add a created at field of type timestamp. It doesn't have to be nullable, and the default value is now. So let's add that column, and this enables us to, in our queries file, go into our get user profile query, and for saved posts we can add that we want it ordered by, created at, in descending order, and we can do the same for posts as well. Order by, created at, DESC. And when we do that, we should see the newest posts on top, as well as for the saved posts. So jumping forward just a bit, I decided personally on the transformation of limit and pad for all of the media files to be uploaded for posts. However, the issue is that when we apply the same transformation to avatars, since we're using the same function, it doesn't turn out so well. So we want, generally speaking, a scale. I would recommend a scale transformation for avatars, but limit and pad for everything else. So how do we switch between those two? Well, we can use the same function, but I'm going to personally create a second upload preset. I'm going to add a new upload preset. It's going to be an unsigned. It's going to have unsigned for its signing mode. For its upload manipulations, we can still leave it. We can leave it at scale. We can change the width and height to 500. You know, it has to be square, so we could make it something a little bit smaller. We could maybe make it say 200 by 200 or maybe 300 by 300. But generally speaking, we want it scaled up, and that will be this second upload. This will be the second upload preset. So we'll save this, but we want to give this a name, say avatar or Instagram avatar. And remember that in both of the profile and edit profile pages, that's where we're calling handle update profile pic. Here, let's pass in another argument to the function of avatar. And so we can handle that in the handle image upload function. We can provide a second parameter of image type. And what's that going to do? Well, it can change what we append as the upload preset here. So if the image type is equal to avatar, then we want to use the Instagram avatar upload preset, otherwise just Instagram. Or, you know, I think we could make it this even simpler. For image type, we could just give it a default value of Instagram and instead pass in the upload preset that we want. So we'll change image type to upload preset. If nothing's passed, it'll just be Instagram. Otherwise, if we do pass something, it should be Instagram avatar. So in edit profile, where we're updating the profile pic, we'll pass in Instagram avatar for that. And then for within profile, or actually it was profile picture, we're calling that function in the function of the same name handle, update profile pic. Again, we'll pass through Instagram avatar. So when we save all of this, and making sure we save our new upload preset, when we try uploading a given user's image, we can see it scales up appropriately. There's one more thing I want to mention here. When we log a user out and then attempt to sign up with a new account, we might be prompted to log in, in which case we'll do that. And once we are taken to the feed page, we're signed in. But if we try to go to our own profile page, we're going to get this big error where we see that user is undefined. And the reason for this is that what's happening is the data for the profile page is attempted to be served from the cache. So if we go to the profile page, we would expect that when we go there, it's going to perform our request that we outlined in use query. It's going to fetch all of our user data according to the username in the URL, but it doesn't. And that's because it's still attempting to get the old user data from the user that just logged out. So what do we need to do to fix this? Well, there's a couple of steps to ensure that we're always fetching fresh data for a given request. The first thing that we need to do is we need to clear back within the profile page, at the bottom of the profile page where we're calling the log out or the sign out function. When a user in the options menu selects log out, what we need to do is we need to clear the cache And the way that we do that to clear out all the data from a previous session once a user logs out is we want to use Apollo client. We want to use that hook and import it. And then with this, we're going to get access to the client, and it can use the method clear store. Now, clear store is going to remove all of the data associated with a given session, but this returns a promise. So within our set timeout, we're going to need to add a then, or we can make this async, an async function, and await this, await client.clearStore, and then we can sign out and then push to the login route. And another thing that we can do, if we want to ensure that we're always fetching from the network and not according to the cache, is we can set the individual fetch policy for a given query. So we can add in this object, in addition to variables, we can add the fetch policy option. This accepts a string, and there's a number of different options that you can use. But if you always want to get to make a request from the network and not read from the cache, we use the no cache option. So once we have all of that saved, let's try creating a new account. We'll log out of this one that I've created, user 14, and we see now that when the page reloads, we're able to actually see that profile. But let's sign up with a new user, user 15. So let's sign up and log in. And once we go to our profile page, we see that it loads immediately. We have no problems fetching the user data on the first go around. Alright, so I've made a number of users here. You can see them all within our users table. I've created all of these, and they now have these different created at values, slightly different. And this is going to help us when it comes to actually suggesting other users for our current user to follow. So we're going to, as I mentioned, work on the explore page. I'm going to log in with a given user, the user that I've been logged in for most of the time in our app. And we're going to work on the explore page, and we know it's two parts. We're going to suggest some users up at the top, and then at the bottom we want to explore some posts. So we want to construct a query. We'll go to our queries file, and we want to construct a couple of queries. The first one that will export is going to be called suggest users. And this is going to be shown in a lot of different components. For example, our follow suggestions component, or our feed side suggestions component. Now, generally speaking, when it comes to the way that Instagram suggests users, it often suggests users that are following you. So if a user is following you, it'll take the IDs from the followers, or at least what we're going to do is we're going to take the IDs in the followers array, and we're going to see if a user has any followers, and if they do, we'll suggest them for our current user to follow back. But in some cases, if say you're a brand new user, you're not going to have any people following you at that moment. So we still want to suggest some other profiles, say profiles that have been created around the same time as you, but aren't necessarily following you. So we want to suggest users from followers, and also users created around the same time. So let's head to our console and structure this new query. We're going to add a new query, and this is going to be for users. And first of all, it's going to have a limit. We want to pass in a certain limit for it. So we want to provide that as a variable. In some cases, we'll want it to be 5. In other cases, we might want it to be, say, 20. But right now, we'll just hard code the value as 10. And we can create a variable for it to pass in a dynamic value later, since, as I mentioned, we're going to be using this in a number of different components. And we want the users where the ID is in an array. So we can use, instead of EQ to see if, say, an ID is equal to another ID, if we're dealing with an array, we want to see if an ID is in our array of follower IDs. We can use the in operator here. And this is just going to be an array like this. So that's our first condition, but as I mentioned, we're also going to want users that were created around the same time as us, some other newer users that it might help them out to follow them too, and they might follow you back more easily. It's a good way to get some new followers pretty quickly. So let's take a step back, and instead of this where clause being like this, I'll remove all this, we still want where, but we want an or condition. So we want either, and I'll wrap what or is equal to with an array here, because we're going to have a couple of conditions. We're going to have or, and then we're going to have our first check to see if the ID is in that array that we mentioned of follower IDs. And then we want to add a comma, and then we want the created at field and see if its value is greater than, meaning it's newer than some other user IDs, some other user accounts. And that's where our created at value is going to come in handy. So we're going to need to have three variables here. We'll need to have, or we're going to call this suggest users. We're going to have one variable for limit, and this is going to be an int and required. We're going to have another for the follower IDs, and this is going to be an array that will be required. And it consists of individual UUID values. Each of those will be required within the array. And then we're going to have a created at, which is going to be a timestamp. And we're going to need to look at the documentation to see exactly what that is. So let's go into query and let's take a look at posts, because we know that they have a created at value associated with them. And we see that their type is timestamp TZ, timestamp time zone. So we can copy that and paste that in. Now, for the in operator, we'll supply follower IDs. We'll provide limit, the limit variable to limit, and then to greater than we'll provide created at. Then for what we want to return here, we just want all of the basic pieces of data to be able to show all of these suggestions. And those are the ones that are necessary are ID, username, name, and profile image. And I believe int needs to be capitalized. So we want to provide an object here, and let's set limit, say, to 20. For follower IDs, we'll just leave that as an empty array for now. But for created at, we're going to need to get an actual value for one of the users of their created at. I'm going to take my original user that was created at the beginning. So go all the way to created at and grab that and provide that down here. And when we run this, we can see all of the users that were created more recently than us. So since we know that this works, we can copy all of this and we can paste it in the suggest users variable here. So let's head over to the Explore page, and we're going to go into Explore Suggestions, and we're going to run this new query and follow suggestions. So we'll go in there, And we're going to need to get all of the follower IDs from user context, which we'll import, get follower IDs. Then for the variables object, we'll set limit to 20 and follower IDs as the property and value. And then we want to use a query. We want to use our suggest users query, and we'll pass in variables and get back data and loading. We can remove the declaration of the loading variable here. And if we scroll down, instead of generating all of the data, we can now say data.users.map. And we can remove the import up at the top for get default user, that function. And let me just scroll down and make sure everything looks good for follow suggestions item. Now here we want to pass down the ID to the follow button. We'll pass ID to a prop named ID. So that looks good. Let's, for the time being, comment out explore grid. We will make a query for that in just a second, just to display all of our posts to suggest to the current user. Let's go in to the explore page. We're getting an error, cannot read property users of undefined. We go into follow suggestions. And of course we're forgetting the timestamp, the created at timestamp for the user. So we need to provide created at, and that's going to come from me dot created underscore at. So we're going to need to destructure me also from user context. Now we're also going to have to grab created at from the me subscription. We're going to have to add that field back in subscriptions. And once we do so, perfect, we can see all of our suggested users. Now the next step is to make this follow button work. Good thing we already have the mutations for this. So we can go to follow button. Note that I've been passing down the ID from prop, so we want to destructure that. And we're going to need to check once again whether the current user is already following one of these users here. So we're going to need to read from context, user context, and grab the current user ID as well as following IDs. And we'll need to create another variable is already following. So we'll say following IDs dot sum is the following ID is it going to be equal to the ID that we're receiving here within the button, and we'll pass that as the initial value for is following. Now we need to create both of the mutations. We use mutation, pass in both follow user and unfollow user. I'll get each of those mutate functions. And remember that the variables for each of them that can be passed to each of them are the same. We just need user ID to follow, and that is the ID we're receiving, and then the current user ID. So for the follow button now, instead of setting following to true, we want to create a new handler function, handle follow user, and then for following button, handle unfollow user. Very similar to our save button and like button in our post component. So handle follow user, handle unfollow user. And first, in handle follow user, we want to set following to true, and then call follow user with its variables. We'll just do the opposite for handle unfollow user. That is with the unfollow user function. And I believe that's it. So we can save this. And for any of the users here, it says we're already following them. And I made a mistake. I set ID to following ID here. It should have been a comparison if the following ID is equal to the ID that we're receiving in the follow button. There. So we can follow any user that we want. And if we refresh, that state should be persisted. Good. Now the next step is to display all of the different posts that we want a given user to explore. And this should preferably posts of users that they're not following. We don't want to have both the posts that a user is following in the user's feed as well as in the Explore area. We want the user to explore posts from users that they don't know about just yet and help them find other followers, other sources of content. But these posts that we're going to display here should be pretty popular posts. They should have a lot of likes and comments, and we should display that in descending order. The posts with the most likes and comments up at the top to the ones with the least. So let's go to queries and write this out. We're going to call this one Explore Posts. And this is going to be posts with the most likes and comments at the top. And it's going to be newest to oldest, where the posts are not from the users we are following, or the current user is following. So let's write this in our console. So we'll add a new query named Explore Posts. This is going to be for the posts field. And we want to order them by, first of all, created at in descending order. But we also want ones with the most likes and comments. So we can actually select the likes aggregate and the count and do that in descending order too. And the same for the comments aggregate, count, and then in descending order. And we want it where, select the posts where they are not in the following IDs. The IDs of the users that we're following, we don't want them to be users that we're already following, already users in our feed. So where IDs is not in, so as compared to the in operator, we can do n in here, not in a given array. And we want to display grid posts here, so we're going to provide all of the same grid post fields. And as you might remember, all of our grid posts are being displayed in our profile, so we can just find that query to get the user profile and select this area right here for posts. Select all of those fields and paste them in. So we can prettify this. So good, we're getting a bunch of posts from users that we're not following. So let's copy this and add this at the bottom of the queries page. Now we haven't added the variables, but I will right now. So we don't need to set a limit. We can if we want to. In the next section, we're going to cover creating an infinite scroll. So we can limit this if we want, and you can apply the same technique that will apply to our feed here if we want to limit it. And then once you hit the bottom of the page to see more posts, but right now I'm not going to do that. Right now we're just going to have one variable called following IDs, and it's again going to be an array consisting of elements of type UUID required, and the array itself is required. By this I really mean it can't be null. And then we'll pass the variable following IDs to the not in operator. And this time we're going to go to the explore grid component. And again, we can get rid of the loading variable declaration. We're going to want to use query, bring in explore posts, and we'll create our variables. And this is just going to consist of following IDs. We'll get that by reading from user context. And then we're going to pass in variables to our query, get back just data and loading. And here, instead of getting a default post, we will just say data.posts.map and save everything. And we will uncomment out explore grid in our explore page. So let's navigate there. And good, we can see a bunch of different posts from users that we're not currently following. Now, I want to take a minute to improve the individual profile page, the individual post page, I should say. It looks like when we refresh, we're getting an error here, and it's telling us it cannot read property aggregate of undefined at grid post. So let me try in the post page, in the post component, rather in the grid post component. I'm going to console log post and see what we get. So it looks like we're getting the data here. We go into post. We don't see a likes aggregate or a comments aggregate here. And the reason for this error is because in this more posts from user component, we're passing the wrong data down to grid post, where it doesn't include information about the likes aggregate and then the comments aggregate. So we need to fix that. But while we're at it, we might as well just create that separate query to get more posts from a given user. So let's head to our console. We want to make a query more or get more posts from user. So naturally we're querying for more posts. And generally speaking, this area is limited to just 6 posts, 6 additional posts. So we can hard code that value. And we're going to get back, we are going to want to get back all of the different fields for grid posts. ID, media, and then likes aggregate, count, and then comments aggregate, and within it aggregate and count. And we want the posts where the user ID is equal to what we pass in. So let's create a user ID variable of type UUID required. And we don't want it to be the current post. So the way that we can ensure that that's not the case, so let me spread out this, the limit and the where arguments, to ensure that we're not displaying a post that is the current post that we're looking at here. It's not this post. We can say, can add a comma after this and use the not operator. Make sure it's not, does not meet the current condition, this condition where ID is equal to the post ID, and we'll provide post ID as a variable and make that of type UUID and required. So let's query for posts, and hopefully there's one user that has multiple posts. Actually, we can go to user, users, and then within it posts, and then ID, and we'll look for a user that has multiple posts, or we might need to make multiple ones. So I'll make another post here. And after doing that, I should see one of my users is having 2 posts. So we can return our previous query, and then, well, we also want to get the user's ID. So users, posts, ID, and then we also want to get the user's ID that it's associated with. So now we can return the previous query. For the user ID value, we'll just copy this ID for which they have 2 or more posts. And then, actually it should be this one. And we can just choose one of the posts for the post ID, and we should get the other ID here that starts with 3F1 when we run this query, and we do. So since we know that this works, we can copy all of this, paste it into queries, for with the variable get more posts from user. Paste that in. We'll run this in the more posts from user component. We'll again use query, grab that variable, and we'll of course collect our variables here. One of them is going to be the current user's ID. So we'll grab that from user context. Grab current user ID. Actually, my mistake, it shouldn't be the current user ID. We're actually going to need to make another query to get the ID here. We want the ID from the post that is in the post page. The reason we're going to make another request is because we're going to need to get the user ID. We can't just grab the post ID from params. We're also going to need the user ID. Let's go back to queries here to provide. So we could make just a query called get post, and we don't need it to be a subscription. So let's just go to subscriptions, and we can copy this get post, but we don't have to get all these fields if we don't want, and we can just turn it into a query. But we'll still need to pass the post ID, and we need to get the user ID. So we can get rid of all these fields, just the ID, and then ID from the post and the ID from user. And that's it. And here we can still pass the post ID as a parameter down to more posts from user. And we can destructure that in the props. So we'll get the post ID here, but we will need to use the post query, the get post query, and it's going to be a little bit tricky, but we're going to need to provide as the variable here for variables, we're going to need to set that to post ID, and the result is going to be data and loading. And if we're not loading, we want to perform the other query. So instead of using just a generic query here, we want to use a lazy query. So we can perform that when this is done being executed. So we'll import use lazy query, and we can, once again, like we did in the search component in the navbar, we can use an effect function to manage this with use effect. So here we're going to have data and loading as dependencies. The function that we're going to get back from use lazy query is going to be called get more posts from user, and that's what we're going to pass to this function. We're going to call within this effect function, so we'll provide that as a dependency too. So if we're loading, we want to return. That means we don't have our data yet. But if we do, then we want to create both of those variables. User ID, that's going to be set to data.posts underscore by underscore pk dot user.id, and the ID is going to come from, we could get it from the parameters, but I'll get it from the data. The post ID is going to come from data.postbypk.id, and then we can create another variables object with each of those values, and then call get more posts from user and pass in the variables. Now we know that the data comes back as part of the second array element that we destructure from use lazy query, and we need to grab it like this. But this is going to conflict with the data that we have here, so we're going to have to rename it. And we can fortunately rename stuff as we destructure it, so we can just use a colon and say this is, more posts. Now this might also be in flight too. We want to check for loading here if we're in the process of loading when executing this query. I know we talked about this being executed synchronously, but we still need to determine whether this is loading with another loading value that we can destructure from this entire object. But once again, we're going to need to rename it to loading2, or something else at least. So finally, we can remove the loading variable that we have here. We can remove the user context import. And at the bottom, we just need to check and make sure if we are loading or loading2, we show the loading icon. Otherwise, we can take the result that we get from more posts dot posts dot map. So now let's save. And what we can do is, if we're still getting an error here, we can add a question mark after more posts if it's telling us it can't read property posts of undefined. So good. Now we see our one post, and then we see any other post that the given user has made. Now we need to fix this up here, this default user.username situation. And the way that we can do that is by taking the top of our ternary and bringing it to the top of container and wrapping all of this in the else condition with a fragment, and then saying, and then using the username that we're getting as a result of our query. So we might want to modify our query just a little bit just to at least get the username. So back in more posts from user, the link will be to data.posts by pk.user.username, and the same put underneath for the text. Post by pk. Okay, perfect. So now we can click on that user's other posts. We can go to their account and check them out and see if we want to follow them.